Okay, good morning, ReactConf Australia. My name is Erik Rasmussen. You may know me online where I look a little bit like this. And today I'm here to talk to you about everyone's favorite part of web development, forms. And specifically, forms in React. So to understand a bit about building forms in React, you need to understand the meaning of controlled versus uncontrolled inputs. For example, an input is uncontrolled if you do not specify a value prop. This is going to allow the underlying DOM element to manage the value changes for that input. But if you do specify a value prop, then you're going to have what's called a controlled input, and React will make sure that it is always rendered with that exact value. No matter how hard you bang on the keyboard, you're not going to be able to change that value unless the React developer goes and manages those changes of the value for you. So what does that look like? Well, this is the simplest possible component here. We're going to use React useState to get a value and a setter for our set value. And we're going to give that value to the input component. And then we're going to add an onChange handler that's going to take the React synthetic event and get out the new value from event.target.value and call our set value on it, which is going to then re-render this entire component with a new value. Pretty easy, right? So this is a two-line component. But there's a bug in this component. Does anyone see what the bug in this component is? It's only 2 lines. React developers, come on. There's no initial value given to our use state. So on first render, value is undefined, so it's going to be an uncontrolled component. And then in our dev tools, React is going to tell us, hey, this input went from being uncontrolled to controlled. This is probably a bug. It's easy enough to fix, though. All we need to do is provide an initial value, and now we're good. Now, this here is pretty much the extent of what the React docs tell you about managing form state in React. Just how to have one controlled input. It would have been so nice if Facebook had said, okay, here's the proper way to manage many inputs, how to manage a big form in React, but they didn't. They left it up to the community. And I have a little pet theory about this. It's probably not true, but if you think about it, Facebook's most important form on their most important product, how many inputs does it have? There's just one input, right? And this is true of Twitter and Google. The main interaction is there's just one input. So how do we build more forms with more inputs? Well, you can imagine taking our use state example there and duplicating the use state. Say we have 3 different fields. You've got 3 different use states, and then you've got your inputs, and you have to remember to pass the right setter into each input. But it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly, and if you want to do validation, then that's a whole other knot. So, and there's so much other bits that is form state. So what do I mean by form state? Well, obviously you've got your field values you have to maintain. But then there's things like if there's validation, which of your fields are valid or invalid, and is your whole form valid or invalid, and then which of your fields are dirty and pristine, or is your whole form dirty and pristine? Maybe you don't need to send the data back to the server if it hasn't been modified. And with your validation errors, is it a form-wide validation error? Is it specific to each field? Maybe you need to know which field is currently active so that you can maybe show a little tooltip to help the user figure out what they need to do or style it differently. And then you've got things like visited and touched, which is has any particular field had focus and then lost focus. That's really useful for showing error messages. And then maybe you need to know if a field has been modified, even if it's been returned back to the pristine state. And of course, now that we use Ajax for everything, you've got to know whether or not you're currently submitting. Maybe you need to show a spinner or gray out the submit button. And when your submit has finished, has it succeeded? Has it failed? What are the submit errors? And if you're displaying submit errors next to each field, maybe when the user goes to try and fix that error, you want to know if the field has changed since it was last submitted. There's all of this stuff that I call form state, right? And if you're building a moderate-sized form with moderate complexity, you're going to need to know about and think about all of this stuff. So pretty easy, right? You can imagine doing all that with your useState hooks. So remember how I said that Facebook left a lot of this to the community to work out? Well, the first form library that got really popular in React was one that I wrote called Redux Forum. You may have heard of it. To this day, Redux Forum is one of the most downloaded form libraries in the React community. It's used by companies all over the world. It currently has about 2 million monthly downloads. And in my years of maintaining Redux Forum, boy, I learned of so many different edge cases and use cases, the different needs that people all over the world have with forms that I would never have thought of. And over these years, the community and I agree that global application state is not the best place to keep your form state. So some of the feedback that I received, and if you release something and it becomes popular, you will get feedback. Some of the feedback I received was things like, what do you mean it's only for React? Some people are using Redux with other frameworks. If this is just a reducer, why is it so tightly coupled to React? And also, maybe you've got some other application state management solution and you just want to manage some form state and you have to install this whole other global reducer contraption. And also, why are parts of my form having to re-render when I'm not really changing anything about, I don't need to be notified about that state change. And the big one, literally, is it's a big library. 27K gzipped is a large thing to add to your bundle, especially if you just need a small little form where you don't need to download all of the complex logic for building these edge case dynamic field arrays and stuff like that. You shouldn't need to incorporate all of that if you just want to do a simple thing. So I thought there must be a better way, and I took all of this feedback and I wiped off the whiteboard and I said, what would the perfect form library look like? Well, what if it could be just pure JavaScript, no fancy data structures, no immutable JS or Lodash or anything like that? And what if it could be framework agnostic? Because if you think about it, all that stuff that I said was part of form state, none of that is directly related to React or to Angular or anything. No matter what front-end framework you're building your forms with, you still need to think about and maintain all of that state and information. And what if it could be subscription-based, where you can specifically say, these are the parts of state that I care about? If you've used GraphQL, you can understand how powerful that can be, of just saying, this is the only bit that I care about. And if it could be modular, like you can start off with the core engine and then build on additional functionality with other libraries as you need it, as your requirements grow. So I thought about this, and I came up with a solution, of course, called FinalForm. And FinalForm is a standalone form state management engine. It's framework agnostic. It's just pure JavaScript. It's subscription-based, so you can go and say, hey, call this callback when this particular part of the form state changes. And it's got plugin capabilities that let you modify the behaviors as you, to not have just the default behaviors. And it's got 0 dependencies, and it weighs in at 5.2K gzipped only. And although FinalForm is framework agnostic, its author is not. So I've also written ReactFinalForm. Yay, React. And ReactFinalForm is just simple React bindings to FinalForm. It maps form and field state to render props, and it knows about React's synthetic events. And because it's just a thin wrapper, it's not doing any of the, it's doing a little bit of logic, but not doing a lot of logic. It's only 3.3K gzipped. So together, they combine to form a total React form solution at 8.5K gzipped. Now you might wonder, how does that compare with other libraries? Well, I've done that research for you. And it looks something like this. So not only is ReactFinalForm smaller, but it even has some extra features that some of the even fatter libraries don't, like keeping track of which fields are active and things like that. So if bundle size is important to you, and I think it should be in 2020, I strongly recommend that you consider checking out ReactFinalForm for your next project. Or if you're stuck in a brownfield project, there are migration guides from the two most popular form libraries out there. And they are really easy to follow because both Formic and ReactFinalForm copied so much of their API from Redux Forum that it's really all quite similar. So let's look at this API. ReactFinalForm consists of three main components. There's form, which wraps the entire form and provides form state to a render prop. There's field, which registers a field with a containing form and provides field state and callback functions to a render prop. Callback functions being things like onChange and onBlur and stuff like that that you need to give to your input to make it work. And then there's a third sort of mysterious component called FormSpy. And FormSpy provides a way to read form state from within your form without re-rendering the entire form. Now, if that sentence doesn't make a lot of sense quite yet, maybe it will by the end of my talk. And of course, the title of this talk is Modern Form Development. So we've got some hooks too. ReactFinalForm was one of the first libraries to have hook support. And with hooks, we've got useField, which basically transforms any of your components into a field with all of the benefits of render control that the field component has. And useFormState, which lets you subscribe to any bit of form state in any component. And useForm, which allows access to the underlying FinalForm instance. So let's see what this looks like in action and try some live coding. Okay, so here we have a fairly simple form. There's three inputs. This is probably big enough. We've got your form component on the outside here that is wrapping the whole thing and gets render props here and gets state via render props. You've got our values and whether or not we're currently submitting, and our handle submit function that we have to pass to our form on submit. And then we've got these three field components here where you specify the name, and then you are given field state. It's divided into input and meta. Input is all the stuff you need to give to your input, which you can just nicely spread here, and then you're done. It's all hooked up. That's like value and onChange and onBlur and those things. And then you've got meta, which is your error and touched and things like that. So as I use this form, there's some validation. So when I step out of my field, it now becomes touched and my validation shows. But I can type in here, and these are controlled inputs, and then it can display here. Also, down at the bottom, I'm outputting my JSON of my current form value, so you can see it change in real time like that. So this is how a lot of form libraries are going to look in your code. But I want to talk about what makes ReactFinalForm special and different. And that is this fine-grained control over rendering via subscriptions. So I've got this component here called renderCount, which just outputs how many times it itself has been rendered. So we're going to spread some of these around. And they say naming things is hard, right? So now we've got these little circles here. So this one at the top right is how many times the form itself has rendered. We've got one for each field, and we've got one for this little box down here. Okay, so notice when I focused on this field, the whole form had to re-render because the active field changed. And then as I type in here, with every little key press, the entire form is re-rendering and all the fields are re-rendering. So This is fine for small forms. You do not need to worry about all this fancy optimization for smaller forms. But there are people that have 300 fields and not 3 fields, and for those, and when that happens, things can start to slow down. So what can we do? Well, both form and field have a subscription prop, and this is an object of booleans. It's a little bit like with GraphQL, where you could specify which things you want to subscribe to, or if you've used MongoDB, a projection, something like that. So here, we need to say exactly which bits of form state we care about. And we can see what we're using here of submitting and values. So submitting true, values true. And for our field, we have a similar one. And here, we are using touched and error. True. And what you don't see is inside this input is we also need the value. But if you didn't include that, it would become obvious very quickly. So now we're only, on all of our fields, we're only going to subscribe to these things that that we care about for our rendering our UI. Okay? So now, when I type into this, when I focus on this field, nothing is re-rendered. And when I blur, the field's going to become touched, so only this field is going to re-render once, but nothing else is re-rendered. So as it gets better, it gets better. So now, when I type into this field, what we expect to happen is that only our field is going to render. But we have a problem in that every key press, all of our fields are having to re-render, and the whole form is re-rendering. But that's because we're outputting our values down here, right? So we can't subscribe to values in our whole form, because otherwise it defeats the whole purpose. If every key press you have to re-render everything. So now, when I type in here, only the field that I'm typing in is re-rendering. The whole form hasn't re-rendered at all. But we've lost our values down here. So we need some way to get form state from within our form without re-rendering the entire form, which you may recall is that description of what FormSpy does. So with FormSpy, we can come down here around our JSON. Subscription. And now we have our values again. And now watch what happens when I type into my form. Only the things that need to re-render are rendering. The whole form is only rendered the one time, and we can get notified when we need to of the exact parts of the state that we care about. And when I hit submit, the whole thing's going to re-render because, whoops, if I can fill out the form right, because we're subscribed to submitting still, but you can imagine getting rid of that as well. So that's just a little taste of the capabilities of optimizing with ReactFinalForm. Again, for small forms, it doesn't matter, but if your forms get really big, you will be glad which form library you've chosen. Okay, back to the presentation here. Mirror. Okay, we survived the live coding. So I want to talk briefly about how and when to choose a library. Not just a form library, but any library when you're shopping around for ways to solve your problems. First thing is, how complex is the problem? If you just need to have a button that changes color or a simple login form with 2 fields, you can probably handle all that state management yourself. But if you need a big calendar widget or you have a big registration form with lots of validation, you might want to look to a pre-made, battle-tested solution on NPM. And also, how extensible do the libraries that you're examining look? Are they going to be able to grow with your needs as your requirements grow? And one way I like to determine how extensible libraries are is by looking at the examples that there are in the documentation. For example, there are many things that I love about Zeit's Next.js, but one of them is their extensive directory on their repo of all the different integrations for all the different possible companion libraries, the CSS and JS libraries or the Node servers. And that gives me, as a consumer, that gives me confidence that no matter how my requirements change, Next.js is going to be there with me. It's going to be possible to handle those new requirements. And similarly, ReactFinalForm has over 40 examples in the documentation of all the different use cases from all over the world that I learned about when maintaining Redux Forum. I made sure that they all work in ReactFinalForm and even some that don't work in Redux Forum. So again, bundle size isn't everything, but if you're between two libraries, it could maybe push you over to the edge to one side or the other. And I'm not saying a lot about GitHub stars or NPM downloads, because in my experience, the older the library is, the more of those they're going to have. And it's not necessarily a better library just because people started using it a long time ago and haven't refactored to the newer, better thing. So don't pay too much attention to those metrics. And finally, just does it make sense to you? Do you get a sense of how things are working under the hood? And if one library just jibes better with the way you think, then use that one. So there's one more thing I'd like to tell you guys about. There's this project I've been working on for a few months now, and I'd like you guys here to be the very first to hear about it. It's one thing that when, as developers and designers, we think that we're building good UI. But if you've ever built this thing that you think is just the most intuitive possible UI experience, and then you sit back and watch a user use what you think is just blazingly obvious what to do, you can be very surprised, because it's so hard for us. We're so close to our creations to understand how our users are actually using our UI. And when it comes to forms, we want to know, how do users use our forms? Like, we know when someone submits our form because we save that data to the database or whatever, so we know about submissions. But how many times do people start using our form and then leave, and we don't get any feedback, and there's no submission, there's no AJAX request? And when that happens, which was the field that they got down to? Maybe they filled out 3 of the fields, and then the 4th field, they were just, screw this, I'm going to do something else. So that would be nice to know. And how long do they spend on each field? Maybe one of the fields really stumps a lot of our users, and it would be great if we could provide extra information to help lubricate that process. And maybe one of our fields is more important than the others, or maybe it would be good to make sure that people get to the fields that we care about sooner. So after contemplating this problem, I've built a tool to help provide insight into these metrics and to help you and everyone build better, more efficient forms, and which ultimately will lead to our goal with forms is to get them to submit, to have a conversion, to get a new lead for our business or whatever. Anyway, I'm calling this service Form Nerd, because you're outsourcing someone that knows a lot about how people use forms to come and examine your forms. And it provides things like submissions versus starts over time, and how your conversion rate changes. So if you make a change to your form, you can see if your conversion rate goes up or down. And at the moment, there are over 20 different metrics for each field, so you can see how many keys are being pressed in each field, or if you can get a sense for how people are using your form, which I think is important. So this is just between you and me. Whatever you do, don't photograph and slide and tweet this that I'm leaving up here for a couple of seconds here. Don't blog about it on your podcast. We're currently in private beta, and you can sign up now at the websites to be notified when we launch, which hopefully will be very soon this spring. And if you're here at the conference, come and talk to me. Maybe we can get you into the super secret private beta thing. Thank you very much, Australia.